This week on Quadriga, UN Climate Change Summit, hot air in Durban. Will the world leaders assembled in Durban achieve anything more this year than they did last? It's nothing less than the 17th meeting of the parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and it occurs at a crucial juncture. The latest evidence shows the last decade and a half to have included the hottest years in history. Yet the only instrument designed to fight global warming, the Kyoto Protocol, is set to expire next year. Your host, Melinda Crane.
Hello and welcome to Quadriga, the international talk show on DW-TV. So will the Durban meeting produce anything more than hot air? That's what we want to talk about with three experts who've been following the process closely.
Dagmar Dehmer reports on the environment for the German newspaper Tagesspiegel. She often covers issues related to development, particularly in Africa. Christian Schwegel writes on climate change and policy for the German news magazine Der Spiegel. A biologist by training, he has also covered research and science for the culture pages of the Frankfurter Allgemeine newspaper. Ramesh Jowra heads the in-depth news agency based here in Berlin. Born in India, he focuses in his reporting on globalization and its effects on the lives of people in the developing world.
Christian Schwegel, is there any reason to hope that Durban could be a breakthrough for the climate change process?
I don't think we should wait for a breakthrough, and I think it's a bit problematic to focus all hopes that we can save the world from catastrophic climate change on a two-week conference somewhere in a conference center. There are some signs of positive processes, like debates about a better protection for the forests and a green climate fund. But at the very core of what we are talking about, the outlook is pretty bleak because the only instrument that would guarantee binding reductions in emissions is running out, and Durban might become a symbol for this failure to produce something that is binding and that is actually working.
Dagmar Dehmer, does the fact that Kyoto is about to expire next year mean that this is the make or break moment for the UN process that has been going on for so long?
No, of course not, because the Kyoto Protocol is not really expiring. It's only the first commitment period which is expiring. And of course it becomes somehow empty, but the architecture will remain. And
tell us a little more about that, if you would, please, for all of our viewers who are perhaps not entirely cognizant of how the process works.
Yeah, I understand. It's actually, there are several tools that were invented in the Kyoto Protocol. For example, there's a possibility to reduce climate gases in developing countries and get some certificates which can be used here in the European emission trading scheme. So such instruments will remain to be there. But without an ambition, without a second commitment period in which countries say, yes, we will reduce the emissions, of course it will not lead to much. But anyway, I mean, it's only 15% of the world emissions still covered by the Kyoto Protocol. So this would not solve our problems anyway. But it is an important symbol, and it is the only working contract. We should not give it up easily.
Ramesh Jowra, what kind of expectations do you have of this process? We've, of course, seen past climate summits where there was hope held out, like Copenhagen, fail. Do you have any more hopes for this one?
One should never give up hope, I think, because otherwise the humanity cannot exist. The only breakthrough that I can remember was the Kyoto climate change conference, because something internationally binding, came out of that conference. Before that, of course, the first conference which took place in Berlin, which laid the foundation for the whole process to start. Ever since, we have been placing lots of high hopes on every conference, climate change conference that takes place, and we were disappointed. So to say that there'll be any breakthrough or this is a make or break conference, I think it's overdoing. We should not be so pessimistic about what will happen to the international climate regime. But we have to be very realistic that there are no short-term solutions because there are so many stakeholders. Different countries have different interests, and it's not very easy to coordinate, to synchronize all those interests which exist. Take the United States, take Europe, take Russia, take Japan, take Canada, and the whole bloc.
Not
what
to
you call
mention the emerging
world.
economies like
the whole
India.
bloc, developing world, and then you out of that you pick up China and India and Brazil. So things are moving ahead, but that doesn't mean that we have reached the tether end of hope.
Christian Schwegel, you've attended many of these conferences. You've been reporting on the subject basically since Kyoto was agreed. What went right in getting to Kyoto that, for instance, failed at Copenhagen?
Well, I think that there was a lot of momentum in the 1990s after the Earth Summit 1992 in Rio, when humanity probably for the first time realized there was a collective and global threat and that something had to happen. I think what went wrong since Kyoto is that the focus has been too strongly on a perceived burden of reducing CO2 emissions. So from the very outset, the whole process looked like one had to share or distribute negative impacts for the economy, instead of looking at the potential positive sides of what this might mean. For example, increased research in energy technologies, increased business with energy technologies, green jobs, green technologies that might help face climate change. I think what went wrong is that
people here in this country do see it that way, don't they?
Well, absolutely, and we do have tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of green jobs that have been newly formed in Germany. This is, the German economy is very strong on environmental technologies, and you now have companies, big companies, let's say big technology companies, giants, that make like 40% of their turnover and even their profits from green technologies. So here in Germany, you get a real feeling that, yes, that's the future for our economy, that you can actually make money with green technologies. And that should have happened worldwide, that we are not talking about how to share burdens, but that we are getting into a competition for making money with green technologies, with protecting nature. And I think that is something that has not happened, and that's why we are in such a mess.
So it sounds like you're telling us that it's partly a communication problem, that we're not getting the right messages out there. Do you think that's right, Ramesh Jha?
In fact, going back to Kyoto, the hope was that because the United States wasn't in favor of the Kyoto Protocol, the hope was that the three tools which emerged out of the Kyoto Protocol, the Clean Development Mechanism and the joint implementation and the carbon market, that these would be attractive for private corporations. And it was hoped that the United States will be a party to it indirectly, even though not at an official level. But I think the problem was also with Kyoto Protocol was that it tried to share the burden, as you rightly say, instead of looking forward and saying we are trying to do something positive for the world economy, for the health of the people of the world. So this sharing the burden business resulted in the problems that we have until today, up to the Green Climate Fund. And may I briefly go back to the Earth Summit, which you mentioned. The Earth Summit is the sort of mother of three conventions: the Climate Change Convention, the Biodiversity Convention, the Convention to Combat Desertification. And the main idea behind the Earth Summit, which for the first time combined environment and development, not development and environment and development, which means they're closely intertwined, was that the industrial countries have to take the lead. Because that is where, those days, the technology was in their hands, the economic growth was being practically guided by them. The question that we have to ask ourselves is, have the industrialized countries really fulfilled the responsibility? And this will, of course, be one of the issues when we meet next year. When we meet next year in Rio.
Rio plus 12. Let's pass that question right on to Dagmar Dehmer and ask, to what degree the failure of the U.S. to get out in front on this issue, despite the fact that Obama, of course, swept into Copenhagen and in backdoor sessions negotiated a voluntary agreement, which, of course, then didn't really stand up to the test. How much has that failure of the U.S. Proved to be the downfall of this climate change discussion process?
Actually, I think the U.S. holds the world hostage in the climate question since more than 20 years. And of course, Obama has the problem that he's the president of a country which has the same people as there were when Bush was the president. And the people seem to think they are living on their own planet. The problem is there are some billion people more in other countries living on the same planet. And in America, there's no feeling for we are part of the world. Mm. And that problem cannot be solved politically. That is a problem that is sticking deep in the American society.
I think it's a cultural, a huge cultural problem for the U.S. itself, but then for the world, like Dagmar says. I mean, we used to look at the U.S. as the country that leads the world also in science and technology. So that might, for example, mean that now the U.S. scientists and engineers provide the solutions to the world for our energy crisis, for renewable, cheap energy that might help billions of people in the world to gain a similar standard of living. But the US doesn't do that. It pumps billions of dollars into subsidies for fossil fuels. And culturally, the US, for me, it's like a country in addiction. You know, it's addicted to cheap oil. It's addicted to cheap money. It's addicted to cheap sugar in the way people eat. And what we experience is a resistance towards withdrawal therapy. And I think the US, sooner or later, has to undergo withdrawal therapy, and it might become something positive. I would hope that the US becomes the world leader again in green living, green lifestyle, in transforming this American way of life into a global way of life that is sustainable. But so far we are not seeing that, frankly, and that is a huge. It's not only a pity, but it's also the US is failing the world basically.
Yeah, sustainable.
And as we know, of course, many people in the U.S. continue to challenge any evidence presented on the actual change in the climate.
Never before have so many greenhouse gases been circulating in the atmosphere. This according to the latest findings of the U.S. Department of Energy. Emissions rose last year by a full 6% compared with 2009, due largely to soaring energy consumption in such dynamic emerging economies as Brazil, India, and China. In the industrialized economies of the West, on the other hand, CO2 emissions have been slowing over the past 3 years, partly due to new climate protection laws, but also as a result of the economic crisis.
So there we have it. More very distressing evidence presented, of course, by a U.S. authority, and there's been plenty of proof in the U.S. as well, and yet we see a continued denial by many, many people in the U.S., including many corporations. Christian Schwegel, in the end, does it all come down to lobbies?
Well, I think lobbies play a huge influence in this. I mean, remember that George W. Bush said in 2004, I think it was, that the US is addicted to oil and we need to do something about it. But what happened afterwards was this huge backlash against this approach. And I mean, of course, it's very easy to earn a lot of money with fossil fuels, in particular if you get billions in subsidies for it. And of course, the lobby interest is very, very strong, and that has distorted U.S. politics. I mean, that Republicans in the U.S., don't trust the National Academy of Science and actually don't trust the worldwide academies of sciences that bring together all the knowledge scientists have. It's a scandal. I mean, the Republicans, they should be the party of science, and they're not. They're the opposite. They're, the voodoo party, basically, in terms of climate science. And that is, it's frightening, really.
Ramesh Jama, how much acceptance is there of the evidence in a country like India? Many of the countries that have emerging economies that are now so energy hungry, as we saw in that little report, are, of course, also the countries that are going to feel climate change first through extreme weather, through drought, through flooding. Certainly that has also been the case in India. Are people there convinced that climate change is real?
Yes, certainly. People feel it in some parts of India or in Bangladesh, which is a neighboring country. But the problem with India is not that the government is not in favor of doing everything possible to tackle the issue of climate change. The problem is how to go about it at international climate change conferences when it comes to the basic issues of what the convention wants and what the West taken as a block, which it is not, what the West wants. Sustainable development is something which is accepted by different groups, different interest groups in India, which includes the industry too. Sustainable development in the United States, I fear, is not taken as a concept which applies also to the United States. It seems to apply only to the poor countries of Africa or to the poor countries of Asia or Latin America. I vividly remember that at the Kyoto, there was a big expectation when it was announced that Al Gore, the vice president at that time, is coming to Kyoto, and he delivered a speech. And the moment he delivered a speech, there was a complete disappointment. He said, "Well, I love you, but I'm sorry, I cannot be with you." That was more or less what he was saying. Mm-hmm. So this already at that time, and so we can't blame just Obama, because no. Obama is only heading a country which is ruled by corporations and by corporate interests, and we can't blame the desire of the average American people who want to stick to cheap fuel because they are not told to do anything else, and that's the American way of life. And we have to ask ourselves, what is the media doing in the United States? Media has a role to play. And if we believe in free democracies, then media should exercise its influence also on the government. So what is happening there?
So, Dagmar Dehmer, we have an impasse. On the one hand, we have the U.S. Basically saying we're not going to get on board this process, and especially not during an economic crisis. And on the other hand, we have emerging economies that say we want the same right to grow that the industrialized world had. How do you break an impasse like that and get countries to act in their own long-term self-interest?
Actually, I think the only chance we have is leading by example. And I very much hope that example of the German energy change really will work out and will not fail on the inconsistencies we have in our government and in our governance in the whole. Because that would be a strong example. A big industrial country, I think the fourth biggest economy, really going renewable. Yeah. And showing that this does not mean that we have to live in small holes again or in caves or wherever. Yeah. But that means as a lifestyle which can be more sustainable. I'm not sure if we, with that, already lead to a sustainable lifestyle, but at least in the right direction. Yeah. And that would be a strong mark for a Chinese government to say, well, if they can do it, we can do it, and that's good business.
Some people question the degree to which the climate change talks themselves are leading by examples. They've become something of a three-ring circus over the years. Let's look at the unique atmosphere in Durban.
It's the largest conference ever to be held in Africa, an event with a greater impact on Durban than even the Soccer World Cup that took place across South Africa last year. For 2 weeks, the conference center is hosting 25,000 people, of course in fully air-conditioned meeting rooms. Besides official delegations from 194 countries, those in attendance include scientists, environmentalists, NGO workers, journalists, and demonstrators. 160,000 guests are registered at hotels across the city. A UN climate conference generates an atmosphere all its own.
Christian Schwegel, an atmosphere of hot air.
Well, it is an atmosphere on its own, that's true.
Protesters, of course, have also assembled in Durban, and we've seen some environmental protests recently in the U.S. as well, with calls for climate justice.
Right.
Is there any chance that a momentum could come out of that kind of a process that could begin to break the impasse we're talking about?
Well, I mean, climate justice is a very interesting, very important concept. It actually originates in the US. It was thought up by a couple of very interesting scientists, but it was then taken up by the Indian government. And it basically means that you approach this whole topic by asking how much CO2 can we put into the atmosphere in the next decades? And if you then start distributing that per capita. And if you look at per capita emissions, the US is at 20 tons per citizen per year, and a country like India is at 1.5 tons per capita. So the difference is huge, and climate justice basically says every human being has the same right to this budget that is allowable in the next decades. And climate science tells us that would be about 2 tons per capita. So 2 tons would be the ceiling, actually, by what climate scientists say. And Germany is at 10 tons, the US is at almost 20 tons, so you see how far away we are. And that, of course, if you start approaching it this way, puts a lot of pressure on those that are above this ceiling of 2 tons per capita per year. And if you look at it this way, it becomes very tangible for also individuals. If you start making your own CO2 budget, how much CO2 do I cause by driving my car, taking a plane, eating a lot of meat or whatever, and it starts to become very, very tangible.
Flying to Durban.
Oh, flying to Durban, exactly. Yeah.
Air-conditioned hotel rooms.
Yeah, you can offset it, of course, with certificates and so on. But
that's also
it is a real question, absolutely.
Problem of offsetting, and that's a fundamental problem also with the Kyoto Protocol. That in the industrialized countries, you can buy the carbon, and then you go ahead.
Fly EasyJet, and then you give them €3 more, and then you
give
get
it
an offset.
to the poor African or whatever.
Well, if it happens for real, I don't think there's anything wrong with it. Actually, if it's some scam, then of course it's not right.
No, but
it's better than doing nothing. I think it's better than just flying without thinking about what you do. And if you then, the money you spend on offsetting, you can't spend it otherwise.
Let me ask you another aspect of climate justice, and that is the question of mitigation. I mentioned earlier that the emerging economies are exactly those countries that are likely to be hit hardest by climate change, which theoretically would argue for actually giving them an additional measure of support here, not only giving them an equal right to emit CO2, but also compensating them in some way. How far are we along in that process?
I don't think we are very far in that process. If you look at the present discussions which are going on in Durban, or even before Durban, about the Green Climate Fund, the EU has very clearly said that if the Green Climate Fund really comes to be established, then it will not be used to give them funds to India or to China, but to the poorest developing countries. So, absolutely right. Give the money to people who don't have the money. But you also have to take into consideration that here it's not a question of development assistance. Here it's a question of trying to curb the CO2 emissions. And if you can help even countries, economies, emerging economies like India or China, and that's still developing countries, let's not forget that, then we are providing a very, very important contribution to tackle the climate change issue. And see, I see the problem in the fact that we often tend to lose touch with the reality. The very fact that, not here, but the very fact that we say, okay, India and China, now they are the culprits, and we have only historic emissions, and so that's the end of it. Let them also do their part. That's also a fundamental issue in the discussions which are going on.
Well, sure, but China and India, they claim that they want to be the superpowers of the future. Then I think they cannot withdraw from responsibility. You can't just.
China has never said it wants to be a superpower.
Well, but if you look at what they are doing,
but indeed, it's well on the way.
Building up a Pacific fleet.
Before we're altogether out of time, I would like to focus on the poorest of the poor, Africa. Dagmar Dehmer, you have covered Africa extensively in your work. What does all this mean for the African countries?
Well, the African countries, of course, were in trouble before, and climate change is extending the trouble. But of course, even in Africa, it is not only climate change which is making life really hard. It is the bad governance, it is the failures of governance before, and the changes people do themselves. I mean, if there's no forest left in Kenya, then it's not really surprising that droughts are happening more often and that the water supply is insecure. So these things are all going together.
So work to be done on all sides. We'll see if any of it actually is achieved in Durban. Thanks so much for joining us, all of our guests and all of you out there for tuning in.